We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Harry, find your head, be president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
It is Monday morning, June 17th, and we finally got about 40 to 45 minutes here to I guess to shoot the breeze for a little bit. There's so much to talk about. I think that would be an understatement, but I think that a lot of what we want to talk about, things that have gone on over the last couple of months, combined with, I think, where we're headed, at least domestically here in the United States, with this presidential election, as we keep talking about, referring to as the uncharted waters of our American political landscape. I think a lot of these matters, they go together. Like, I think a conversation about the nature of campus protests and political Zionism and American Jewish issues being right at the forefront of the biggest protest movement in the United States since the 1960s, certainly when it comes to young people. And then that combined with, I think, the precarious position that we find ourselves in terms of presidential politics in our upcoming 2024 election, and the Biden-Trump dynamic, and the problems of Biden and the shortcomings, to say the least, combined with the obvious dangers, I would say, of escalated dangers of a second Donald Trump presidency. I think these topics, they all end up there's a symmetry there where they all end up having there's a lot in common there, and you can make a common thread from the topic of like protests and discourse and language and rhetoric, all the way to the issue of our presidential 2024 politics, which I continue to emphasize is just really more and more we're seeing just like everything from the cognitive mental decline in different ways that shows between both candidates, all the way to, for the first time in history, we have a convicted felon running for one of the two major political parties. It's just continues to be uncharted waters, and it's pretty wild to see play out. And we're actually going to be attending a debate watch party on Thursday, June 27th, the first presidential debate between Trump and Biden. And we'll be, I think, coming on to talk about our experience after that. But it's shaping to be, to say the least, a very interesting and unprecedented election season. Not a fun one to watch if you're like, but certainly just. But it all ties in with things that we've seen over the last couple of months, geopolitics-wise, with the Middle East, and the topic of Zionism, and the topic of Israel being right at the forefront of the of rhetoric, all the way to the universities, and the biggest flare-up of protests we've seen in probably going on close to 60 years. I mean, it's quite a time there, and we've thought a lot about that at the time that we haven't. We talked a little bit about it in our late May recording, although that's not what we focused on, but the nature of the fact that, like political Zionism and the topic of the state of Israel and Jewish issues are right at the center of this, what was, at least in the spring, and it may flare up again, we're not sure, but of the biggest protests on college campuses going back at least to the Vietnam War era.
Yes, and as we spoke about last time, that as we're now into the summer now, not officially in terms of the calendrics, but at least in terms of the end of schools, and I think all colleges are on break, and it appears that is now sort of settled down to some extent in terms of what will actually come from these campus protests. And I do think there's an interesting there are two parallels in history in terms of the campus protests. And we might even describe this current moment as a sort of a synthesis in certain ways of the 80s activism on campus that really was focused around things like divestment in terms of then apartheid South Africa, where there was some amount of protest, but it was really more focused in terms of very direct organizing and activism in relationship to college endowments, and speakers and that kind of approach, rather than something like an occupation and very visible protests that I think we saw more from the 60s protests, that were a combination of things like free speech and also obviously anti-Vietnam War. And so I think if you merge those in some way, I think you get a good sense of the nature of some of the college protests in terms of Palestine, Israel, the assault on Gaza, and the larger question of political Zionism, which I agree with you is more intensely in the public domain and discourse than ever, really ever before. And I would harken back to when Biden came in, we predicted that the main question that would sort of become a flare-up, a major issue. And this came from some of the parameters that we saw in terms of what Trump had done, including the Kushner fake peace plan and the Abraham Accords, which fit directly in with what Netanyahu was directly saying about attempting to transcend the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian question, or even to sort of to back end it in a way that fits very much in with the policy and rhetoric of generations of political Zionists and actual leaders of Israel themselves, which was basically, even back to Ben Gurion, this idea that we are going to engage not as a modern post-World War II international relations diplomatic type of state. We're going to engage as a military garrison warfare state and prep. And if you look at the history, actually manifest, generate conflict as a mode of their statecraft, and that the end goal was to basically threaten both the Arab world, including the Palestinian people, but also to frighten the West into backing the political Zionist project that had then emerged as the State of Israel. And the point was, at least as this is what was stated by Ben Gurion, is that we will show the Arabs the immensity of our military power, of our violent power, so that they will be forced to accept our existence as this type of Jewish homeland, in this case, a Jewish state. And that specific rhetoric now actually is now coming to the forefront. The question of political Zionism, is it all about a Jewish state? Is it about a Jewish homeland? What is the actual political question here? And that has come into the foray, where you hear rhetoric from circles you would have never heard it publicly before, where it was always about a Jewish state. And now Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hosted a little bit more than a half-hour Zoom dialogue of some sort about weaponization of anti-Semitism, alleged to be both about the miscalling, the misuse of the term anti-Semitism against those who were just pro-Palestinian, but also the watching out for the rise of real anti-Semitism as what's said to be a threat against democracy, or the canary in the coal mine against even all of liberal Western civilization. And AOC had on two representatives of really the Israel lobby in all reality, again, always claiming to be representatives of the Jewish community. But as I call it, the Jewish community capitalized with a trademark on it, because it's not really, they don't these are not really the organs of an actual Jewish community. These are organs of what has developed over multiple generations as the so-called Israel lobby, but the Zionist power configuration in terms of its operations in and with the Jewish community, the actual Jewish community in the United States, and politically in terms of the commanding heights of the United States. And so one of the representatives was from the ADL, was a younger woman from the ADL, I believe, and then an older woman from the representing the Jewish community relations, I think they're called. Basically, as I've seen over here in Kansas City, they represent an organ of the AJC, but also are in direct relationship with the Jewish federations, which are the mainstay organization that can be seen to credibly have an involvement in actual Jewish community life, and that they actually have places where Jewish people actually get together and celebrate and commune in certain ways. But when it comes down to it, as we know directly from our experience at the Kansas City Public Library in May of 2016, the Jewish Federation and their organs, like the foundations, which are really the endowments of the Jewish federations, are organs of the Jewish state, of the Israeli state when it comes down to it. And they're willing to sacrifice the rights and security. There was a lot of talk of Jewish safety. These organs, including the Jewish federations, obviously the ADL is well known as just a weapon in many ways of deep politics when it goes back to the 60s, and the spying and the working on behalf of or with or handing glove with the compromised, the Jewish mob compromised J. Edgar Hoover in terms of Martin Luther King Jr., obviously, but way beyond that. But the Jewish federations we saw are obviously, in terms of their foundations, the base, when it comes down to it, the question of money and existence of backing the organizations, the power politics of it, teaming up with the Truman Library Institute and then the Kansas City Public Library to celebrate the anniversary of the founding of Israel with a lecture by Dennis Ross, known by even his own liberal Zionist State Department colleagues as Israel's lawyer.
Aaron David Miller, yes.
Yes, that to host him to give a lecture on Truman and Israel. And we saw that these organs are willing to sacrifice both Jewish rights and Jewish security to the power politics, the deep power politics, I would say, of the the alleged interests of the Jewish state in the United States of America. So that's that. But I'll just finish up by saying that this was the first time I'd heard some of the people in these circles. And by the way, right after October 7th, I'd been invited on email to attend an in-person conference in Kansas City via the AJC and I believe the Jewish Relations. I'm not sure the exact name of it, but these organs were hosting an event to talk about October 7th and the Jewish community and Israel-Palestine, and I RSVP'd for it, and then I was given a direct email by the director in Kansas City that I was not invited, that I was not going to be allowed to attend. So obviously the so-called Jewish community will allow some Jews into the community, the so-called community, and others will not be allowed. So there was a very interesting shift where the language of Jewish homeland rather than Jewish state kept popping up in this conversation. And this is really, I believe this is an interesting and potentially important rhetorical shift, I believe. And I believe that it shows that even the presence of this conversation with AOC both sort of, going through the motions of of this very weaponized version of anti-Semitism, still very new anti-Semitism on the table, a lot of lauding, of Deborah Lipstadt, the who's basically following the patronage of the Epstein network under Les Wexner's capacity, millions of dollars of funding directly for Lipstadt in different capacities under the Wexner umbrella, the Wexner Krisha, the Wexner crime roof, we might even say, as we know, in terms of Wexner being at the epicenter of the propaganda push via Frank Luntz in terms of trying to sell the then very recent 2003 Iraq invasion that was very much pushed by the totality of the Israel lobby, even though large portions of the actual Jewish community in the United States was against it. Every single member of the so-called Jewish community TM, aka the Israel lobby institutions, pushed for the Iraq war. And then you have Les Wexner funding and backing Frank Luntz to do a study basically about languaging, about press relations, PR, communications, as much of our actual journalism schools in the United States, even here at the University of Kansas, it's basically a large, substantial portion of investment in the next generation of communicators is not about serious muckraking investigative journalism. No, these are people who are being trained to then go work for these power institutions, corporations, in terms of PR, which is really what these two representatives on with Representative AOC were involved in. So Wexner backed Lipstadt was being praised in terms of the new anti-Semitism, but there are these very intense shifts of rhetoric from Jewish state to Jewish homeland that I believe are new and indicative of a new environment.
Great point there. And on the topic of Lipstadt, she's obviously financed by this Les Wexner syndicate, and then you've got bringing in the language of the new anti-Semitism of Natan Sharansky. So there, between Wexner and Sharansky, like those are two, I think, examples of certainly national in terms of U.S. American Zionism, U.S. Israel lobby, and then these multinational Zionist, organized crime, intersection interests that, say, maybe a Natan Sharansky represents. So it's very, very mobbed up, forced type of language of these elements that are very, very heavily into all sorts of organized crime interests, big money interests that are dictating how to talk about, dictating to the general populace on how they are to talk about, or dictating to governments how it's going to be sold to the general public that you talk about these matters related around Israel and the topic of the Jewish people. So yeah, that doesn't get mentioned, like with Lipstadt when she's facing congressional opposition from like mostly Republicans, say like Tom Cotton or Ted Cruz. Like, it's all about something about how, it's going to be some type of anti-Christian or some type of usual weaponized like right-wing way of going about these things. Whereas like, and that might be a problem with the example of a problem with the state of our discourse of where we're at, is that the people who might be more inclined to point out like the problems with these the types of sources financially and rhetorically that, say, a Deborah Lipstadt and her ilk use to dictate as the anti-Semitism czar, the language of how these topics are going to be talked about and the sources that they come from. That's not, you would think that maybe a Sharansky or a Wexner, maybe Deborah Lipstadt should get maybe a little more of a critical eye looked at in terms of the funding and the sources of information, the sources of philosophically wise, et cetera, that maybe some of the members of the U.S. Supreme Court are getting, but that's not really happening. And I think that should be happening, because I think that is significant that it's a combination of Wexner financially and at least rhetorically, Natan Sharansky and all that he represents are really the primary backers or sources or involved in terms of dictating this Deborah Lipstadt, in a government position, politics of and how anti-Semitism, quote unquote, topics of Israel, the Jewish people are discussed. It's I don't think that's focused on enough.
I agree with you, because then you have the intersection of these two main pieces of Natan Sharansky as this public character. One was that he was the forefront of the George W. Bush reasoning, principle, we might say, policy for the Iraq War after the Office of Special Plans, Zionist disinformation cell aspect of that this was all about nuclear weapons or, NBC, nuclear biological chemical weapon threat from Saddam Hussein. After that fell out, especially, there was this major push by the George W. Bush administration to say that this had to do with spreading democracy and nation building in the Middle East. And Natan Sharansky's book, alongside Ron Dermer, as you pointed out, repeatedly, Greg, very important point, that Natan Sharansky and Ron Dermer wrote this book together that was the book that, the little red book that Bush would flash in terms of the justification for the Iraq War. So there's that pillar of Natan Sharansky, and then there's Natan Sharansky, the godfather of the new anti-Semitism, which it's very clear that Deborah Lipstadt is a disciple of, is the sort of the next generation guru in the commanding heights, in this case, the anti-Semitism ambassador, the anti-Semitism czar in the United States government, trying to deploy and from the commanding heights, the rhetorical commanding heights, to discipline in terms of Natan Sharansky's new anti-Semitism. And yes, all of this with a background not only of the creches of organized crime, which in Natan Sharansky's case is very direct in terms of Russian organized crime as he came into Israel and then it very quickly ascended to the political commanding heights. He was even apparently involved behind the scenes in making sure that, peace talks between Palestine and Israel did not work out. There are those pieces of information behind the scenes there, but also helped with the rise to power of the Likud party and the Netanyahu network specifically, while also trying to push some of the Russian, largely Jewish organized crime syndicate money into these commanding heights in Israel, while accepting a good bunch of it for his own reasons, Natan Sharansky. So that is a crucial piece of this. And then, of course, there's Les Wexner, and you can go look at all of the Bob Fitrakis journalism, who is a local journalist in the case of Wexner in terms of Columbus, Ohio, and has done a lot of the deep digging years and years and years ago in terms of the questions of Wexner, the Iraq War, organized crime, the suspicious death of lawyer Shapiro, of the relationship of Wexner and Epstein being called the boyfriend in a Ohio Inspector General report. I believe it was not ever publicly published, but people got a hold of it. And of course, Wexner is the one who then supplies the pre-wired for not only security audiovisual, but very obviously recording in a manner that displays intent to organize high-level compromat, sexual compromat, sex trafficking compromat in terms of the brownstone in Manhattan that was then basically handed over to Epstein, where a substantial core of the blackmail operations were then done. And so this is a very significant piece here that should be dealt with. And of course, AOC didn't touch on any of this. She sort of nodded along. I think she even directly maybe celebrated Deborah Lipstadt herself. And it was Wexner, I believe, who directly funded Deborah Lipstadt in her civil suit for defamation against David Irving, even a whole big budget Hollywood film, I think was it titled Defamation, maybe? I think maybe. It was created, and Lipstadt is portrayed in a sort of non-fictional manner as a very positive character. And what I've directly encountered with Lipstadt, she did an event in Kansas City, also I believe sponsored by the Jewish Federation and Jewish Community Foundation in Kansas City. She's not I don't find her a very interpersonally compelling character. She's pretty hostile. I got a chance to ask her some questions on the stairs, and she very quickly did not respond to the actual content of them, which had to do with Epstein and Wexner and Wexner and the Iraq War, and very quickly started slandering me. So defamation is at the heart of this network, I would say, in terms of accusing other people of that. One area where AOC did seem to be playing a very, very important role, actually, in some kind of it seemed like a rhetorical negotiation of some sort, actually, where AOC was standing up to some extent for maybe members of her political squad who had been unjustly accused of anti-Semitism in terms of their pro-Palestinian activism and public statements, and she did not seem to give any line to the organized Jewish Israeli lobby folks in terms of the conversation, while saying we need to watch out for Jewish safety. So it's a very interesting moment, because I believe that the shift from really holding on to the rhetoric of Jewish state, Jewish state, Jewish state, which I believe is actually a full pillar of the 3Ds, the 3D test of Natan Sharansky's new anti-Semitism. In fact, I believe it's very likely the first pillar. I think it's under the pillar of delegitimization of the state of Israel, right? The state of Israel, the Jewish state specifically. And then you have demonization, where they then go into conspiracy theories. This was an area where AOC was basically a total pushover and allowed the two representatives of the Israeli state rhetorical interests, I would say, in all of this, to basically make an analogy between those who would turn George Soros into a Jewish globalist boogeyman to those who were publicly doing journalism and writing about the group of Jewish billionaires who helped organize, in some cases, really, and backed what was really a domestic terrorist response, especially when it came down to the UCLA protests. Right, and the article came out, and it was vilified about just identifying the names of some of these Jewish billionaires who were involved in in what could be said to be a democratically legitimate response to protest the content of the political content of which they disagreed with, but really ultimately ended up in like Israeli operatives and other Zionist operatives on the ground in UCLA doing violence and really low-level terrorism against the Palestinian protest. That's what we saw. That's really what came out of it. And there's still this unresolved question from very early after October 7th in terms of Colombia and low-level, chemical warfare being used on pro-Palestinian students and other protesters. It looks to be very, very, very Israeli, at the very least, Israeli resonant, but very likely actually Israeli involved, likely actually Israeli organized in terms of some of these things. So the Israel lobby representatives to AOC in this conversation were trying to basically tamp down any discussion about the politically powerful Jewish billionaires. That included people like Bill Ackman, who led the post-October 7th assault on the institutions of higher learning in terms of very driven by this definition of new anti-Semitism, was fairly successful in terms of Harvard, but also someone like Sir Len Blavatnik, who we've discussed for almost 10 years now in terms of very early on after Trump came in. We made a special note that from I think it's the Dallas Daily News or Dallas News newspaper that did a very interesting article about this major shift in Blavatnik's political funding for the 2016 campaign, where he put all his eggs that used to be more bipartisan in a way, in terms of funding, all into the Republican, and specifically it looked like sort of the backing of this 11-9, ultimately Trump operation. Blavatnik, very sensitive in terms of, has very strong, aggressive PR and communications type people, refuses to be identified as an oligarch, and selects questions and in general tries to avoid any type of real journalism in terms of his operations, both in the United States but also more globally, and specifically the background, and it's a stunning moment in terms of especially like Ackman and Blavatnik. Blavatnik, weeks earlier had been on stage while the director of his, a documentary that he financed won an award for a documentary, and that involved the question of, I believe it involves the question of Israel-Palestine to some extent, and saying, talking about their own Jewishness as men, and that they don't want people to use their Jewishness as men as a way to justify atrocities and oppression of another people, in this case Palestinians. And so Blavatnik was there. He didn't put up a word of protest, and then meanwhile, a few weeks later, it comes out that he is part of this group of, I'll call them Jewish oligarch billionaires. There you go. Deploying their very obvious, political power, not only funding, but also really influence in terms of, how you can get people to do things, in alleged response to these protests on campuses. So I'll just finish up by saying that in this AOC conversation, that it's very disingenuous. I would say really almost dishonest. It's deceptive, actually, to use the George Soros boogeyman question in relationship to trying to tamp down this very well documented, especially incident that is immediately publicly important in terms of the question of Israel-Palestine, and these factually Jewish billionaires involved in organizing on a call behind the scenes that then had public results, some of it what I would call low-level terrorism, especially at UCLA, and that whole mess. To then say that this is just part of the second D of the three Ds of Natan Red Mafia Sharansky's new anti-Semitism of demonization, which always comes along with Jewish and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and all of that. And this might not have been an actual conspiracy, but this was an analysis of political power of Jewish oligarch billionaires deploying their capital, deploying their political assets to get things done in public in a way that I actually believe is a threat to democracy, in terms of what this conversation said it was really about. And then, of course, the other really, I would say, disingenuous at the very least part of that kind of attempted squashing of real serious publicly interested speech and political analysis of power, in terms of equating the George Soros boogeyman thing with this actual group of Jewish Zionist oligarchical billionaires organizing, is that who actually, as we know now, very journalistically uncovered, especially after 2016 and all of that, who was a major piece of deploying the George Soros boogeyman narrative. We know for sure, we saw the son of the crime minister, the prime suspect, the prime, I would say, 9/11 and October 7th suspect, Benjamin Netanyahu's son, Yair, putting out memes portraying George Soros as the head of a Jewish octopus conspiracy, getting who bigged him up? Oh yeah, Andrew Amschel Rothschild Anglin on the Daily Storm.
The world's number one Yair Netanyahu fan site. And then, of course, you add in, obviously, and then I know what you're starting to get at here, which is maybe some of the specific people who this whole Soros narrative kind of really came around, that being, of course, the figures of Finkelstein and Birnbaum. And then, of course, it's Viktor Orban's Hungary combined with Israel. And there's a big row a few years ago over refusal by I believe it was Israeli government basically refused to step in and condemn anti-Soros material from being put out by the Hungarian government, and that people saw as being there being an anti-Semitic element to, and so it's very much. But yeah, I'll go for that. I was just bringing up how it's through these people that were, these creations like a Netanyahu and Orban, as well as maybe certain media proxies in the U.S. from Glenn Beck in the early 2010s all the way to all the people who push the Soros stuff now. But it's between these governments that were very, very brought in by the Finkelstein network of Netanyahu and Orban that are in some ways Netanyahu's son, but maybe through more of a Viktor Orban himself, which Viktor Orban back in his days, and he was more of a political centrist before his transformation into conservative patriot nationalist hero or whatever, was actually an open society person. So it's
very interesting, Greg, and that is exactly where I think we should go. We should come back to this question of Hungary, specifically in the Budapest Bridge, and how instrumental it is and was in terms of both like the real like deep logistics of the 11/9 operation. We've focused for a while on this idea that it's not only Hungary and Orban's Hungary specifically, and Budapest as this crucial European city, not only represents the bridge between the Israeli piece of the 11/9 Trump operation and the Russian piece of the 11/9 Trump operation, but it also represents a legacy hub of intelligence operations, especially Russian and human intelligence type covert operations in the European sphere. And we then also pointed out that if you go look at maybe more information warfare, you then start going toward, Cambridge Analytica, right? And the epicenter of Israeli interests, but also Russian interests there from someone like Roman Abramovich, who eventually becomes the wealthiest Israeli citizen, while also apparently playing some kind of role in relationship to his background under the Russian Krisha, the Russian deep state Krisha of some sort, and then helps Abramovich starts financing these very substantial lawfare organizations under the guise of sort of historical and religious tourism in the West Bank, specifically around the neighborhoods around Jerusalem, and puts I think $100 million of seed money into one of these organizations that's ultimately works to evict Palestinians, to ethnically cleanse this crucial area of the West Bank. But then in a larger piece, the Cambridge Analytica, or the City of London, the UK more generally, piece of the operations really represent the information warfare. So if it were to be simplistically portrayed, you would say Budapest under Orban's Hungary is the human bridge between Israel and Russia in terms of their ongoing operations, let's say. And then the City of London is the SIGINT, the signals intelligence, the information warfare hub of all of this, and including the specific groups that were involved in the usage of Soros, the boogeyman, to empower not only people like Netanyahu, but Orban himself.
Right. It plays into the politics of both, like, political Zionism as it relates to the state of Israel specifically, but also in what we call white Zionism, which is where you get, a lot of this, that's, I think, fuels a lot of your, anti-migration narratives that, of course, Viktor Orban's been at the forefront of. And then you also have Orban Hungary serving as a proxy for established MAGA conservative, power influence networks via CPAC. As a Hungary, I think, serves as a direct proxy for Russia, that they do their event. CPAC has a whole branch in Hungary now. I think that largely serves as a proxy for Russia. So, I mean, it serves quite a role there in that regard as well. And real quick, I want to just condense one more final thought as we wrap up here. But just going back into the generalized nature of the whole conversation around Israel and 10/7 and all this, is that, it's interesting that we were headed towards some type of, like, reckoning. Like, we analyzed, like, in the months leading up to October 7th, like the judicial protests, and this shift to the right was people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu basically allowing it to happen, while also doing less than the bare minimum to help Ukraine, despite, like, a lot of prominent Jewish voices globally, a lot of pro-Israel voices urging that doing less than the bare minimum to help you. Combination of all this, and a combination of the 11/9 coup, I think, against the American system by installing Donald Trump and all that came with that. There was going to be this reckoning eventually. And, with 10/7, it obviously worked out in a way that I think has been very negative way for the Biden campaign, as this was obviously there was, I think, a understanding that the response was going to be really tepid, to say the least, because of just the power of the Israel lobby and so many bipartisan interests that play there. But combination of a lot of this is all simmering and festering ever since, say, even pre 11. I mean, it's going on for years. Like, you could even look at, like, the entire Netanyahu era, but certainly really ramped up since 11/9, and then the events of October 7th, and a combination of already I think the collision course that, say, like, maybe the U.S. Foreign policy community was going to be on with these hardline elements in Israel that have and also subversive, that are actually negative to the what would be the U.S.-Israel special relationship, and of an actual relationship between the United States and Israel that could actually be certainly to the not that is not in a way that is beneficial to the United States really in any meaningful way, I don't think. But I think a lot of this was simmering and festering for years now, to the point to where we're having now, obviously the one thing about 10-7 is that it isn't a post 11-9 atmosphere, and you can see a lot of areas that Netanyahu and the certainly the more hardline elements are not. That there's not a friendly relationship there between that and a lot of the American, certainly the American foreign policy community. And I think a lot of this has been simmering and festering to the point to where now we're having a combination, where it's come to a combination of issue of political Zionism being at the forefront of the biggest campus protest movement in nearly 60 years, and also this language and this combination of an attempted continued governing of language, but also in a way where it's toned down and a bit more moderate, like in terms of the specific talking points of these Israel lobby operatives with someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So a lot of this was this has been simmering for a long time, but it's still. I wonder how it would have played out in the post 10-7 without a 10-7 style event to have taken place. I mean, but certainly post 10-7, it continues to play out, and there's things that. The relationship really just isn't the same anymore, and the cat is kind of out of the bag in a lot of ways. And so, at the very least, though, you cannot. You got to be very, very careful between balancing like some type of support for the special relationship and protection of like the Jewish state and the way that like a lot of these elements would go about it, with really you can't go back to supporting these hardline elements anymore. We're never going back to the days where most Democratic members of Congress applaud as Benjamin Netanyahu storms the Capitol to berate Barack Obama for the Iran nuclear deal. I think we're long past those days now.
Very much so. And so I do think that we should focus on the opening of this rhetorical landscape, especially in terms of certain acknowledgments, at the very least, that the rhetorical landscape has changed, especially coming out of this very Israel lobby centric circle. And these folks in the AOC conversation are obviously working on the progressive sphere. They deploy their rhetoric as if they are, traditional liberal Zionists, attempting to push past the problem of progressive except for Palestine, while continuing to attempt to use the new Natan Sharansky's Red Mafia, Krishad, and Les Wexner, Lipstadt, Krishad, new anti-Semitism as a rhetorical weapon. They continue to try to use that, but the giving up of this space from a shift from the Jewish state to this question of the Jewish homeland and Jewish presence in Israel Palestine is a very important piece to, I think, move into and actually really attempt to widen that kind of area in the public consciousness, including while pointing out these Achilles heels of the deceptive part of this attempted rhetoric, which includes all of this kinds of stuff that we are getting into in terms of Orban and Soros and Netanyahu, Hungary, Russia, Israel, all of those kinds of things, and the deployment of global largely Israeli-based cyber consciousness operations. Remember, there is actually a unit inside of the Israeli military, the intelligence piece, I believe, that's called the consciousness operations. So I have shorthanded that as con ops, which I think is really maybe a crucial shorthand phrase to reintroduce to the public lexicon, because that's what we saw an attempt by by emissaries of the so-called ADL and really the AJC and the Jewish Federations and the Jewish Relations Board of an attempt to run some type of consciousness operations that are also leaving them exposed in certain ways, both by having to give up a little bit of rhetorical ground while also doing these highly and easily discredited attempts at the first D of threatening people with being called anti-Semitism for delegitimization or demonization in terms of the questions of Zionism, especially. But I'll just point out, like they will not point out that George Soros, to me, it looks like George Soros might be the only Jewish American billionaire who publicly opposed the Iraq War. So in that case, Jewish billionaire George Soros was actually maybe the most resourced and public representative of the majority sentiment of the Jewish American community in terms of the Iraq War. And then I'll just close the loop finally here by saying that I pointed out early on that the thing that we really identified as going to be a problem, especially early on in terms of the Biden administration, was this question of political Zionist power networks and the question of Israel-Palestine more generally. And there were many indicators, but some of the prime ones were obviously Merrick Garland coming in, the sort of the commanding heights of the cover-up of the Oklahoma City bombing, the totality of the Oklahoma City bombing, and that was we'll return to that because it was a key, especially rhetorical moment in terms of, you could say that was the marker of the rise of even the Alex Jones entirety of this aspect of the sort of conspiracy right and all of that. And of course, Garland's background under Dershowitz, who Trump continues to name check as one of the good, one of his backers, one of the good lawyers, as we pointed out at the Trump rallies. More Epstein lawyers should be the campaign slogan of Trump. But then the other real main piece that indicated to us that there was going to be a problem here inside of the Biden administration was Anthony Blinken, the godson of Samuel Pisar, the consigliere of Robert Maxwell, who of any historical figure of the last decades, it represents this conjunction of global deep politics, and especially in terms of Israel, Russia. Leah Pisar, I think her name was, she was inside of the 90s Clinton White House, which saw Jeffrey Epstein visiting over 10 times. So this Epstein Maxwell, locus here appeared to us to be indicative that this was going to be a major problem for the incoming Biden administration. But October 7th, really is a scale, I think, that we didn't anticipate. And we can really now see it, and we will continue to analyze it as an October surprise in an American political context, and an October surprise a year before that continues to now play into the October before the actual election. And of course, who really ultimately seems to be served in a very political, material, physical even manner. It's not Palestinian lives. It's not even Israeli lives. It's not American politics. It seems to be very specific spheres of power and influence politically. It seems to be the Netanyahu-Likud sphere. It was served in some kind of maybe short-term way, but in some kind of very material way, obviously, in terms of long-term plans, short-term political threats against him. His opponents were directly targeted for the October 7th attack in southern Israel. But we also see Hamas is obviously made a lot of it politically. They become a major global political player. They're seen as having resisted this Israeli behemoth. And then, of course, the multipolar world order, especially, I would say, Putin. Putin's Kremlin obviously is using all of this to a major effect in terms of both taking eyes and support off of his, the resistance to his invasion of Ukraine. But then, as you pointed out, Greg, the actual politics of this in an American context are playing into these people's hands. But I think it's not going as well as they might have hoped in certain ways. But there needs to be a clear-eyed vision of who all is doing what for what reason here, and then what, in our case, what we, the American people, the founders of our nation state, the founders of our government, might need to do about it.
And while Russia, kind of benefits from this relationship with Hamas, combined with how things like 10-7 help certain multipolar aims and ambitions, you've got a Russophile conference made up of top, people who fancy themselves as American and Western anti-Zionists, all while the albatross of Israel's crimes gets entirely put around the American and Western European neck.
Definitely. So as we move forward in the days to weeks, there's a lot of real serious geopolitics going on, a lot of serious politics also going on. And so we will work to dig a little bit into the facts of all of that and analyze it. But I would say we do need to keep our eye on what actually continues to go on in Gaza, and then also the dynamics of what's going on in Israel politically, as it's very unstable right now. And Benny Gantz made a public declaration, made a move, attempting, it looks like, to destabilize the Likud-led Netanyahu war party coalition. And there continued to be a heightening of the threats by the truly publicly recognized terrorist religious extremist arm of the Israeli coalition, in terms of the Ben Gavirs and the Smotriches, and keeping an eye on both their rhetoric and their intended action that includes Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque as we head toward the summer. And we've already seen certain organizing of events of storming Al-Aqsa and all of that. I think that was by Ben Gavir's circles especially. And so we know that they have designs in terms of conflagration and taking down the Dome on the Rock and reasserting the Third Temple. And so there is this very, very dangerous, a religious extremist overlay to these real hardcore material, deep geopolitics.
Yes, and just a real quick add on to that. We noticed, remember, going back in November, right after the election of Trump, it was Trump is going to restore the temple, and even Putin was involved in these prophecies and all of this. And remember, the whole narrative was that, the people look stupid who said that the embassy move was going to lead to mass violence throughout the region. But meanwhile, and I've wondered this, I think I mentioned this before, I want to mention it again, because certainly will be a specter in the prospect of a second Trump administration. But, what's to say that there wasn't going to be an effort, say, if people like Michael Flynn had remained in positions of influence and power, combined with maybe some of his national security community, quote unquote, oriented people that were surrounding him and their ilk, and maybe of a few other people of that ilk, that there wouldn't have been some type of major triggering event during the Trump administration to try and actually make that happen. So, I mean, and it's interesting, that might have been one of the cases potentially where, the big bad deep state may have ultimately dodged a bullet of some kind or another. But I don't know if that's the case or not. But I do wonder. I don't think that's implausible to think about. And I think now that, now the escalated potential threat of this happening again, right in the lead up to the potential reinstalling of Donald Trump as president for the second time, I think is something to keep an eye on for sure.
For sure. And in certain ways, I think it's actually could be correct to say that the October 7th and this entire tragic and atrocious, specifically very directly, literally atrocity-born so-called Israeli response to October 7th, that this in some ways is what was people were concerned about in terms of these multiple plays under the Trump years, in terms of the embassy in Jerusalem, which is at the epicenter of the always against instigations, conflagrations. October 7th was called Al-Aqsa flood, right? So at the very least, rhetorically, politically, this was a key piece of it, but then also the short-term success of the Netanyahu operation to throw the Palestinians under the bus in terms of this greater Israel, political Zionist regional push in terms of the Abraham Accords and transcending the Palestinian question. And now all of this is back, in the epicenter of global politics and geopolitics. So that doesn't mean that it couldn't get worse or more violent or bigger conflagration, but we are already in the middle of the result of what we and many other people were concerned about in terms of what Trump came in to do. First and foremost, to nix the Iran deal, thus eliminating some rapprochement and reapproachment between the United States and Iran, and bringing Iran back into the international fold in an American-led way, and then everything that meant about the Hamas on the ground and Netanyahu and the reascending the commanding heights and all of that. So there's a lot that we are seeing that is a result of the 11/9 Trump operation that was backed intensely, not just, but it backed intensely logistically, metaphorically, informationally, politically, and logistics-wise by the commanding heights of foreign powers, maybe especially in Israel and Russia, but not just there. So
I think on that note, it's a good time to wrap up for now, and we'll be back. Hopefully in a couple days we'll do this again. But thanks for taking part in this today, Jeremy.
All right, and thank you, Greg, for doing this, and thank you everybody out there for rocking with us. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.